Thank you for joining us today for this event on the future of school finance in California. It's a tremendous turnout. I think if we would have had this event a few years ago, I don't think we'd have as many people as interested in school finance as we do today. So thank you very much for joining us. My name is Mark Baldessari. I'm President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, PPIC is a nonpartisan think tank based in San Francisco and in Sacramento. And I'm privileged to have our PPIC board member, Donna Lucas, here today, who's sitting in the front row. This event is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series, and we would like to thank them for making it possible to bring this program to you today. This event will also feature some very important new work by PPIC, which you'll be hearing about shortly, and I would like to thank the study's funders, Cabsinel, Silver Giving, and Stewart Foundation, and Derry Cabsinel is here today, sitting in the front row. So thank you. On your chair, you should find two PPIC reports. Let me go to my chair for a moment, so I can point them out for you. First, I'd like to point out the California School District Revenue and Student Poverty Report by Heather Rose, who's here today, an adjunct PPIC fellow and UC Davis professor, and Margaret Weston, also known as Maggie Weston. And please don't talk to her about the NCAA finals last night, because she was rooting for, shall we say, the other team. Maggie is a fellow at PPIC and one of the leading experts in the state on the topic that you'll be hearing about today. So this report, as well as California Education, that's authored by Laura Hill, Paul Warren, and Maggie Weston, part of a larger project called California 2025. And this is, as do other pieces of the 2025 briefing kit, highlighting some of the most pressing long-term policy challenges in California, in this case, education. We'd like you to know about some of our upcoming PPIC events here in the Capitol. On April 25th, here at the CSAC Conference Center, Julian Betts, who's a PPIC Bren Fellow and Professor of Economics at UC San Diego, will present the findings of his latest report on college readiness as a graduation requirement, so also on the education theme. And on May 10th at the Sheridan Grand Sacramento, PPIC will be hosting a half-day event featuring our senior fellow, Ellen Honick, and her colleagues, which will include 3 panels that will explore options for organizing science management and regulatory oversight to improve the health of the Delta ecosystem. Please register for these events at ppic.org, as well as some other events that you'll be seeing coming up shortly. A few more things before we begin. First of all, we have an evaluation survey on the chair. When we're not hosting events and doing other kinds of research, we're doing surveys at PPIC, so please fill out that survey and leave it on your chair. That helps us figure out what kinds of events we have and how to improve on them in the future. And please, like I'm going to do right now, turn off your cell phone so that it will not interrupt the flow of the wonderful discussion we're going to have today, featuring Maggie Weston's work, and then a really superb panel that will follow. And now we turn to today's program. PPIC's research fellow, Maggie Weston, will first provide an overview of the governor's proposed funding formula for K-12 schools, and then a panel of education leaders will focus on the discussion of the implication of the governor's proposal and the relationship between funding and student achievement. I'm pleased to introduce Maggie Weston. She's a fellow at PPIC. She's been very prolific in the area of K-12 school finance and is currently completing a PhD in school organization and education policy at UC Davis when she's not busy working on reports. And she's also been very busy testifying at hearings and helping to inform the debate on school finance policy. Very important discussion that's ongoing today. Maggie, we look forward to hearing from you today, and then Dave Lesher will be moderating a panel discussion. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. So as he mentioned, I want to just provide some overview and context for the hopefully very fun and interesting discussion we'll have in the panel, especially for some of you who may be new to the topic or kind of non-experts on our very complex school finance system. So let me begin by just very briefly trying to explain our school finance system as it exists today in California. So school districts receive funding from 4 main sources. The first is, and largest, are revenue limits, which is a per pupil entitlement that funds basic school operations and is funded by or financed through local property taxes and state aid. School districts can also raise some other local funds, which are in the orange there. These include the sale or lease of unused buildings, parcel taxes, bake sales, etc. The state also provides funding to school districts through categorical programs, which are specific programs earmarked for certain activities or purposes. So you might think of teacher professional development or the K-3 class size reduction program. And then finally, the federal government also provides revenue to schools through large categorical programs like Title I or the National School Lunch Program and special education. So our system is fairly complex in that we have a voter-approved initiative, Proposition 98, that produces the minimum that the state must spend on schools. And so you can see that revenue limits and state categorical aid kind of fall under the purview of Proposition 98. And at the same time, these various funds have kind of restrictions. So the federal categorical programs have to be spent on the programs and purposes outlined in law. And until recently, that was the case with our state categorical programs. But starting in February 2009, in exchange for kind of very large reductions to revenue limits and categorical programs, the state allowed school districts flexibility over about 1/3 to 40% of the funding, categorical funding, and most of the programs. And so in addition to kind of being notoriously complex, researchers have identified 2 other main flaws with our current system. The first is that it's generally perceived to be inequitable in both that school districts with kind of higher needs or costs may not necessarily receive enough resources to meet those needs or costs. And at the same time, school districts that are serving very similar student populations can have different levels of funding. The third main critique is the overall adequacy of our school finance system. So you may read in the newspaper that we're ranked 49th, 42nd, 35th, somewhere kind of below average relative to all states. To address particularly the complexity and the equity of the school finance system, Governor Brown has proposed a weighted pupil funding formula. And generally, a weighted pupil funding formula is one in which there's base funding for all students, and then additional funding, which we call weights, for some subgroups of students or district characteristics. And so he first introduced his weighted pupil funding formula last January, so January 2013. He revised that proposal in May, and it was ultimately rejected by the legislature and has reintroduced a new version of this proposal. So let me outline kind of the key features of the 2014 proposal. So the first feature is that it consolidates most state aid into this new formula. So it's taking revenue limits and about half of the categorical money and putting it all in one pot that it will then distribute in a new way. The base is differentiated by grade levels. So it ranges from about $6,300 per pupil for children in grades K-3 to about $7,700 per pupil in grades 9-12. That averages about $6,800 per pupil and is roughly equal to the pre-recession spending levels of revenue limits. He provides a supplemental weight for students in grades K-3, about 11%. And this is designed to reduce class sizes to 24-1. And then also for students in grades 9-12 to provide career technical education, and that's about a 3% weight of that base. For disadvantaged students, which he defines as students who are on free or reduced price lunch, or English learners, or foster youth, if you meet multiple categories, you're only counted once, there's an additional supplement of 35%, which is about $2,400 per pupil. And then in districts that have more than 50% of their students identified as disadvantaged, they would receive even more funding through what we call the concentration factor. And so this is another 35% for each student above that 50% threshold. So at 100%, if you're a district with all disadvantaged students, you'll be receiving 53% more funds through this formula than those with no disadvantaged students, or about $3,600 per pupil. So what does this actually look like for our districts? So I've selected a few districts just for kind of illustrating the ways that this formula plays out. And these are approximations. So the Department of Finance has released some estimates. The Department of Education has released some estimates. These are, again, estimates. Don't think that these are the magic numbers of what these districts would get. So first, we have the base level of funding. And again, remember, this is based on the grade levels served by the district. And so Escondido, you see, has higher base level of funding. That's because it's a high school district with all high school students who have that higher base level of funding. Any other differences is just kind of that distribution of grades served by the district. On top of that, we have the small supplements for those students in grades 9-12 and K-3. And again, that will only vary by how many of those students, what their proportion within your district. We have the supplement, which is again that 35% weight for disadvantaged students. So this will vary based on how many disadvantaged students you have in your district. So Fresno has about 80% of students on free and reduced price lunch, about 24% of its students are English learners. So they're going to get, kind of that full level of funding relative to, say, Palo Alto, which has about 8% of students on free and reduced price lunch. The concentration factor, remember, that kicks in at that 50% threshold. So again, only districts with more than 50% of their students identified as disadvantaged are going to receive any of that funding. Palo Alto does not. It does not receive any of that funding. The governor has proposed preserving two categorical programs, and this is TIG, which is for voluntary and court-ordered desegregation, and home-to-school transportation. And these funds vary district to district, kind of based on these historical factors and reasons, whether you had a court order, for example. And so that kind of introduces some variation back into the funding formula. And then finally, school districts, the governor's proposal does not cover all funds that school districts receive. Remember, it's about half of categorical funding and revenue limits. So school districts still have their parcel taxes and their federal funds. And so when we include those, we see that some districts have more than others. And so I assume you're reacting to Palo Alto, which has about $4,000 in excess local property taxes, $1,000 in parcel taxes per pupil, and $1,000 in other kind of local revenue raising abilities. So this, these districts would retain these funds generally. So the point here is that, particularly within the weighted pupil funding formula portion of the governor's proposal, there's a very kind of transparent, we can easily understand why some districts are getting more funding than others. What I'm going to show you next is, again, kind of a back of the envelope calculation just to illustrate how the weighted pupil funding formula would change the distribution of funding. So under the world as it exists today, this is the average relationship between the programs in the governor's proposal and the percent of students on free and reduced price lunch. And you can see there's a slight positive relationship with those programs today. If we were to apply kind of these rates to our current distribution, you would see that the governor's proposal, as we would expect, is directing kind of increasing funding for districts that have higher proportions of students on free and reduced price lunch. And so that gap between the orange line and this greenish line shows you kind of the infusion of state aid going forward. And then finally, again, a point we've kind of wanted to make very clear in our report is that there are a bunch of other programs that are kind of off the table in this proposal, and that those funds are actually pretty highly correlated with student disadvantage. And so when we do that and we include all those extra funds, that brown line, you can see that that differential between 100% on free and reduced price lunch and 0% free and reduced price lunch under the weighted pupil funding formula, 53%, you add all of those other programs and we're in the high 70s, 70% additional funds. So again, generally, the proposal addresses some of these concerns with our current school finance system. In a 2010 report with Heather Rose and John Sonsley, we kind of identified reform principles going forward, and the governor's proposal meets several of these principles. So again, we have a simpler formula, it's easier to explain, recognizes a very important cost difference, which is the extra resources needed for students who are trying to learn English and students who generally perform less well on state tests. And it reduces variation by kind of getting everyone on a very similar trajectory. But of course, there are many questions that hopefully our panel will address. And so one is just kind of this overall question of, okay, he proposed 35% as this weight. Is that the right weight? Before, the other proposals had different weights. And so what can we learn from the literature and from other states about how much certain students need in order to kind of meet the state standards? The governor addresses one very important cost difference, but there are others that he does not address. For example, regional wages. So, you know, East Palo Alto and some of the other districts around Palo Alto Unified need to compete for teachers with Palo Alto, and they don't have that extra local revenue to pay those higher teacher salaries. What is this trade-off between base and weight? As I mentioned, the base levels are based on pre-recession, kind of where we were in revenue limits. And so some have argued that we need a higher base level of funding. And so how do we, as a state, kind of look at these priorities and decide where to infuse state aid going forward? And this leads to this final question, you know, overall, as I said, depends on what kind of ranking you look at. We're below the national average, I think is the safest way to say it. And is there kind of a larger concern about overall adequacy? So with that, I would like to invite Dave Lesher up and our panelists to kind of discuss, hopefully, these and other issues.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Very good presentation. Trying to make something complex simple is not easy to do. As our panelists are taking their seats, just a couple quick comments. Obviously, as the governor said in his State of the State speech, this is an overly complex topic. It's obviously also a very important topic. It's about how we spend about half of the state budget and how we teach the students who are going to who our state is going to depend on in the future. And as you can see, we have a very good panel of educational leaders here represented with some of the key voices that are on this topic. And so I'd like to introduce them, and then I will ask a couple of questions trying to surface the different perspectives on some of the key topics that are represented on this panel, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So first, on the left side of the dais here, I guess your right, is Peter Birdsall. He's the Executive Director of the California County Superintendents Educational Services Association, which is a good title for an acronym. He's also worked in K-12 policy as an advocate for a long time, including work with the Department of Education and the Department of Finance. In the center is Assemblywoman Joan Buchanan, who there was a blog that recently said you're the legislator who knows more about K-12 than any other. She is the chairwoman of the Assembly Education Committee and served about 20 years, or nearly 20 years, on a school board, San Ramon Valley School Unified in Contra Costa. And then on the end of the dais, we have Nick Schweizer. Nick is the program manager for the education budget at the State Department of Finance, where he's worked for several years, in the past 2 administrations at least, right?
Yeah.
So that is our panel, and for the first question, I just wanted to back up just a little bit, and before we talk about what we're trying to, or how we're going to fix something, I wanted to see if there's a consensus about, what it is we're trying to fix. What is the problem? Maggie talked about a couple of things, but is there a consensus among the different perspectives here about what we're trying to accomplish? So if I could start with you, Peter, what are we trying to fix with the discussions we're having this year?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the chance to be on the panel. I think there are 2 key questions that are driving the debate, and I warned you that I would bring up the other one. One obviously is, fortunately, we have money to appropriate. That's obviously good news, and so the question comes up, who's going to get it? How do you allocate it? And that was really the nature of the presentation we just saw, which was really helpful. The other question, though, is the flexibility that Maggie referenced is set to expire, the Tier 3, so-called Tier 3 flexibility. And so school districts need to know what are the rules for the use of that money and how can they plan for the future. And so that's an issue the governor and the legislature and the education community need to come to grips with. And that really has profound consequences, not only in the distribution, but also on accountability and governance. So I would hope that as part of the discussion here today, over the coming couple months, we have a really serious conversation about accountability, because the governor's proposal is moving away from categoricals basically means dollars are earmarked for a certain purpose or a certain kind of student. Instead, that would be replaced with they're generally available and governed by a locally adopted plan. So, what is the accountability mechanism for those dollars, and does it work? I think county superintendents have a special perspective on that, because we've been so involved with fiscal accountability, and that has taken years to evolve into a system where there are really clear standards and they are outcome based. I don't think the history in California is really good of driving instructional improvement through plans. We have to do it through looking at what are the outcomes and then intervening and adjusting. So one topic is the funding. Is it equitable? I think most of us do think we have to tilt more money towards districts that have more low income and English learners. But the other is, we've got to come to grips with what's our plan for categorical programs and what's the new accountability system look like. So those are issues that have to be solved ideally this year.
Thank you very much. And Assemblywoman, why are we having this discussion this year?
Actually, the governor needs to answer that question. But let me say this. I share the governor's goal. I mean, if you take a look at California's changing population right now, we have 57% of the students on free and reduced lunch. And California's economic future depends on having a well-educated workforce. I mean, education is more important today than it's ever been, and we can't afford to leave half our population behind. I think we have a moral imperative and an economic imperative to do something about it. So I share the governor's goal. But California schools are funded 49th in the nation. And regardless of how we slice up the pie through this budget process, we're going to be 49th in the nation. And you can't be $3,400 per student below the national average and think that you can provide the high quality education that every child deserves. And so I really think if you're going to talk about the future of education in California, there has to be a discussion about adequacy. And what does it cost to give every child a high-quality education? And then what does it cost to provide the additional time and support for at-risk students so we can close that achievement gap and make sure every child graduates from high school prepared to either enter the workforce or enter higher education. And my hope is that when we're talking about changing how we fund education for the next 40 or 50 years, that we can have a very thoughtful discussion. You know, we had a chance to talk with Maggie, and I appreciate all the work you've done, but Palo Alto is not a great example for a school district that has a small percentage of at-risk students. Palo Alto is a basic aid district. And so Palo Alto gets funding that virtually, you know, no other suburban school district gets. And so, you know, we need to take a look at how a formula is going to affect all school districts in the state of California and what's equitable. And I think equity needs to be defined on what that adequate, that base adequate level is for every child.
Thank you. So next, the governor made this proposal.
Sure. I don't want to speak for him, but I guess it's part of my role here, really. So I mean, the governor did. You know, education is clearly a priority for the governor. You know, one of the few areas in the budget that is seeing an increase in funding. It was a campaign promise he made to address the school finance issue. So, and that's why you're seeing the governor pushing so hard on this issue now. And you know the issues that we see with the school finance system are essentially what Maggie laid out. It's over the last 30, 40 years. We've had a sequence of court decisions, Prop 13, layering on of categorical programs, and then flexing most of the categorical programs has led to this sort of very opaque school finance system where you can't, where at the local level, it sort of precludes a lot of local community priority setting and decision making as to how best to serve their students at the local level, and then at the state level, you can't really tell for sure that the districts that have the higher needs students are getting funded in proportion to the needs of those students, and certainly from the research we have seen, it doesn't appear that they are. So. That's not to say that adequacy is not an issue. I don't think anyone would argue that the current level of funding is adequate. There's a lot of discussion as to what an adequate level of funding actually is or should be. But as that discussion happens, the administration's committed to continue to make education funding a priority and continue to invest as much as it can in funding for K-12 schools going forward. I think that's really the best response to the adequacy issue, is just that commitment that we're going to grow K-12 funding.
Thanks, Nick. I wanted to ask about weights and base, how we define what is going to be, how much the base should be, what should be in the weights, a little bit about some of the questions that you were getting at, Assemblywoman, about how much does it cost to educate a child, and then how much more does it cost to educate those who are at risk. Obviously the governor has made his proposal. How are those estimates or judgments being made in the discussions you're having?
Well, we haven't had discussions yet because, we asked the governor to give us a bill so we could bring it to policy committee and begin to have the discussions. And we weren't there. So actually now I'm the author of AB 88, which is, a 500-page bill, the governor's proposal. And my hope is that we can have a series of hearings in the Assembly Education Committee to really have those kind of discussions. I mean, again, I think if you're going to change how you fund education, it's important to have those discussions and to have some sort of consensus on what is what is an adequate number on how much should be providing in supplemental grants for at-risk students. I think it's important to ask ourselves about certain categorical programs and whether or not they're important enough that they should remain outside the base, funding amount, or whether they should be included. I think we've got to ask ourselves about programs like transportation that is outside, where you can have two districts like Palmdale and Pasadena, both in LA County, with virtually the same student populations, the same percentages of students at risk, and that Pasadena gets $3.2 million in aid for transportation, and Palmdale gets $300,000. And we're going to continue that inequity under this program. That means Palmdale's got to cut $3 million from its general fund in order to fund transportation costs. We have to ask ourselves about TIG, which was talked about. You can have a district like San Jose that has 44% free and reduced lunch and gets an extra $982 per student in TIG funding, and a district like Santa Ana that has 84% free and reduced lunch that gets $8 a year per student in TIG funding. Are we going to continue those inequities, or are we going to try and develop a program that really takes a look at the entire student education funding and begins to make the changes so that we don't do it piecemeal, but we really do it through a thoughtful process, and we take a look at all the programs and all the inequities that currently exist.
What do you think about the weight that the governor proposed? Is that a starting point, or do you agree with it, or what?
I don't know what the right weight is, and I've asked that question of a number of people. Why 35%? Should it be 20? Should it be 50? And no one seems to be able to answer that question. Generally speaking, what I'm sort of getting from people is they think the 30% or so is in the right neighborhood. So I don't know what the answer is. I don't know whether a concentration grant should be double or not, but I think we need to bring in experts in the field and talk to them and determine what's right. Your own report showed right now that we're funding at-risk students at about 36% higher than students in districts that are not at risk. And we clearly know that that's not adequate, but is it not adequate because 36% isn't enough, or is it not adequate because the system itself is so woefully underfunded?
Mm-hmm. Nick, how did the numbers come out?
So essentially we looked at the research, which is, as the Assembly member noted, the research is roughly between 20 and 50% is what the research shows is the additional cost of educating a high need student. So, with that, it was a matter of adding in the concentration factor, which again was based on the research that districts with high concentrations of high need students have actually proportionally higher costs than those with lower concentrations. So it's just sort of a mixing in that. So finding the right balance between the supplemental and the concentration grant, and looking at the numbers and making sure that yes, this new funding formula we're putting forward is going to allocate, additional money to districts with high need students in proportion of the needs of those students. So, it's not, as the Assembly member mentioned, there is no number, right? It's a matter of judgment. And we certainly, over the last, as Maggie mentioned, the governor first put this out back in January, and over the last year and a half, we've had these ongoing discussions with school district representatives from from Latino groups, from low-income groups, from various the various education programs and stakeholders, labor, and so through those discussions, we've continued to adjust and refine. We've sort of refined these weights over the last year and a half to where we're at now, and we're certainly very interested and continue to discuss with folks what the adequate what the right weight should be, but they are based on our judgment after a lot of consultation with a lot of different folks and looking at the research.
Thank you. And Peter, this is more of a district superintendent issue than the county offices, but you've got obviously an extensive background at the local level. Do you have a sense of how you approach what should be base, what should be categoricals, what should be weighted?
Well, first of all, the county superintendents routinely meet with the districts in their counties. So, and virtually every county superintendent has districts of both flavors within the county. They have quote-unquote winners and losers under this plan. So, I guess a couple of comments. First of all, because we talked about adequacy, one of the problems we're not trying to solve, there are not a lot of overfunded public schools in the state of California. So everybody has standing to say that they deserve some of this additional funding. I mean, and so fully understand that. At the same time, I do think, and the Assemblymember said that, there's a lot of support, simply logic behind what I call tilting more money, relatively speaking, towards the communities and districts where the English learners and low-income students are. So finding that balance, no offense to policy analysis, of which I'm one, there's not going to be research that says this is the number. I think we have sort of targeted a range. It'll be a combination of politics and policy that sorts out where that falls. I would say I do think there is some attraction to, at the same time, dealing with the base level, base/adequacy, because that raises the target for everybody and does say we're aspiring to a higher goal. The analogy I use is if Senator Buchanan's getting $80 and I'm getting $100, and we set the target at $100, that's not so enthralling to me. But if we set the target at $120, then we each make progress towards an equitable funding system, but also we're getting some funding. So I think ultimately the political policy solution has to involve looking at the base and trying to set a higher target.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask about one question or one issue that's come up here a couple times, accountability. In the governor's state of the state, I think he referred to it as subsidiarity. But it's the idea of that the decisions should be made at the most local level possible. But the question is, what's the state's role in assuring a quality education for all Californians, and how do we assure flexibility for the local level as well as that minimum expectation of a quality education? So in the governor's proposal, he provides a lot of discretion at the local level. Could you explain the issue of accountability and transparency as it is in his proposal?
Right, and we've actually, in the last January, we sort of have laid out a sort of a more detailed sort of accountability piece to go along with the way it's doing formula. That focuses most of the attention on transparency around outcomes, as well as transparency around our school districts continuing to maintain the sort of the minimum sort of requirements for providing education for students, like certificated teachers, facilities, inadequate repair, instructional materials, things like that. So that's a piece of what we would propose that districts report on as part of what they would do is every year they do an accountability plan and update it every year, and this plan would be required to be linked with their budget. So if they for example, they don't have a certificated teacher in every classroom, the plan needs to address how they're going to fix that. And to the extent that costs money, that money needs to be identified in their budget. Then we'd have reporting on how they have identified the needs of their high need students and how they're using their supplemental and concentration grant monies to address those needs. Would need to be reported in the plan, and again, that money would need to be identified for those activities would need to be identified in their budget. And then there's the piece around the outcomes, student achievement, test scores, achievement gaps, graduation rates, A through G and career tech course completion rates, things like that. Districts should be setting goals and identifying how they would achieve those goals. And again, to the extent that costs money, that should be identified in their budget. So these plans and the budget would be linked together, which is, we believe, a new thing. Currently, there are a lot of plans that districts do, but they're not linked to anything. These would be linked to the budget. They would be reported, they would be submitted to the County Office of Education, which then the county office would, as they review the budget, would also review the plan and ensure the plan addresses all the areas that it's required to address, and ensure that that money that, for those expenses that are identified in the plan are in that budget. And then on the back end, we would have audit requirements to similar to the current audits that are in place around sort of categorical programs and ADA reporting, things like that. We'd have a back-end audit requirement to ensure that districts do spend the money in the way they said they were going to spend it. And also we'd have a complaints process similar to what's currently required for the Williams and for fees. If schools are charging illegal fees, then there's a complaints process that parents can use to address that. So again, it's really focused on local communities making decisions around sort of goals and accountability and being transparent about it and putting money behind it in the budget. We've certainly heard concerns from folks. What if they don't reach their goals, or they're not setting adequate goals, or things like that. And so we're very open to continuing to engage folks around those sorts of issues and see what would be a reasonable additional checks to ensure that those local discussions are happening, that all of the local communities are involved in those local discussions, and that all their students, including their high need students, are receiving the education they deserve.
Thanks, Nick. So Peter, county officers are obviously involved in this under the governor's proposal a bit. What do you think about? You raised accountability earlier.
Yeah.
What do you think about the proposal? And
well, I guess I would. I told Nick earlier the term I would use is promising. First of all, you got to start with the existing categorical model. I think there's a pretty broad-based sense that we have too many categorical programs and they're too restrictive and too cumbersome, and that doesn't mean that the exact package there is the right package. And I agree with Assemblymember Buchanan; they need to be reviewed. And are there some that need to be preserved or equalized or whatever? But as a generic statement, I think there's a pretty close to a consensus. There are just too many categoricals, not enough local flexibility, and that all these silos of money really interfered with best practice at the local level. So I would say that's an improvement to allow more flexibility. The reason I referenced AB 1200 is because that's now over 20 years ago when it was originally, that's the fiscal accountability system. When that was originally adopted, there was a lot of concern about mischief, chaos, confusion, whatever you want to say. And it took a while to build out a system where you end up with clearly articulated standards of what the expectations are, and then a series of communications way before you get to intervention, but some discussion about when problems are occurring. So I think this can take a this is a good start. It's going to take a long time to build it out, but it is the right direction because you need the local flexibility, but you need to then have clearly articulated standards of what are the outcomes that you're expecting, and if those outcomes aren't occurring, then you're going to have a process to first tell locals, hey, it's not happening, fix it. You don't jump in right away, and then eventually you can have more and more serious involvement. But as a model, I think I would say we're generally supportive, and like I said, I'd call it promising.
And Assemblywoman?
Well, I'm going to give you a little bit different perspective here. In fact, when I was listening to Nick, I thought, okay, we're simplifying the system, we're giving you more local control, but we still want you to be sure you spend money in all of these areas, and we're adding on more checks and balances to make sure the locals are doing what we want them to do. I would actually argue that the proposed system has far less accountability than the current system. Under the current system, when we give you economic impact aid for at-risk students, that economic impact aid has to be spent on those at-risk students. Under the new system, when we give you the 35 or 75% supplemental grant dollars for at-risk students, there is nothing in it that requires that money get spent on at-risk students. In fact, the superintendent of LAUSD recently said that he supports the program. This is after the governor released his budget, and he looks forward to having more money, but that's going to allow them to close the structural deficit. It's not going to allow them to add any new programs. And so I think if there's an area where the proposal falls woefully short, it is in the area of accountability. Now, I would say, I would go one further to say, in terms of categoricals, you know, giving me flexibility without adequate funding is sort of a hollow promise to school districts and to kids. You've got to have adequate funding if you're going to put money into the programs that are important to you. But I also want to say that this creates a whole new level of oversight for counties, and AB 1200 is child's play compared to the oversight you're talking about here. Because what the counties do is the county auditors are there to do a financial audit. Do the numbers add up? Do they add up not only for this year, but if you're going to have projections for the following 2 years, you know, can you pay for the programs that you're proposing to fund or the salary increases or whatever? But they're doing financial audits. You are throwing in a whole new level of oversight, trying to determine, are the programs that the districts are funding under this new formula doing what they're supposed to do in terms of reducing the achievement gap and helping to get additional resources to targeted students, and you're being asked to do that. It's a whole different type of audit, and there, you know, with AB 1200, if financially the budget's not sound, you can actually reject the budget. Under this, you're providing a different kind of oversight with no teeth that go into it. So I would actually say there's far more accountability in the current system than there is in the new system. And if you go back to the adequacy studies, the getting down to fact studies that were done by Stanford, they said two things. You have to put a whole lot more money in education if you want to provide adequate funding and have the kind of results you want in the state of California. And they talked about putting, you know, $20 to $30 billion more into education. And then they said, if you spend that additional money and continue to do the same thing, you're going to get the same results. Well, you know, we are changing. You know, we could codify the current flexibility and categoricals and have local control. We're changing what we're doing, but we're doing it without, you know, requiring things to be done differently, without adequate oversight, and creating another level of bureaucracy there that I don't think really accomplishes the goal we want to in terms of accountability.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just one last question before we open it up to questions, and it's one that's come up here a lot, but I wanted to explore it a little bit more about adequacy. You know, how do we is carving up the pie now help us get to adequacy, or is it make it harder? How does it affect the issue of adequacy? Peter, why don't we start with you?
Why did you start with me on that one? Well, carving up the pie now, I view as a function of we have some money now. You have to allocate it someplace. So it's, you know, I disconnect a little bit from the conversation of adequacy because clearly we want to allocate this money. We want to have it out in the hands of school districts to serve students. Yeah, obviously, if we go down a road that creates a lot of discord within the education community, that is probably not helpful to moving towards adequacy. But you know, under the current fiscal system, you know, I expect this Nook was going to say there's not enough money to address adequacy. We still want to hand out this money, so I think we need to have a separate conversation, and I know these conversations are going on within the legislature and among the education groups about how do you rethink the funding system, either through local resources, state resources, to get more money in the system. And I don't think, to be honest, that is closely related to this discussion, unless, in fact, we become so divided that it cripples us. But they are. To me, the only direct link in this one is, as I mentioned earlier, I think there is both a political and philosophical advantage to sort of raising the targets, so we're aspiring to somewhat higher goal, but that also reduces some of the tensions.
Assemblywoman, does the funding formula help us get to adequacy or not?
No, the funding, we have Prop 98 that basically gives us, what, 42%. So whether we distribute that money under the current formula or a new fund formula, we're distributing the same dollars. And so we know that those dollars are far below the level we need for adequacy. And, you know, and California's a big state. I mean, our revenues are going to grow on average at 2 to 3% a year. And so unless we find a funding source to put additional funds into education, you know, we're probably going to go up overall at the rate of inflation. So it's not a question of needing a new formula to distribute the dollars. It's a question of under what formula do we distribute the dollars, and should that formula include the discussion of adequacy, even if it's an aspirational goal or if it takes us longer to get there. And the problem you have today is with this recession we've been in, every school district in the state of California has seen its funding cut over 22%. Every single school district, whether you're a school district like LA Unified that's funded up here and Fresno down here, given the same populations, or where I live, San Ramon Valley and Dublin next door to us, every school district has seen their budgets cut. And they all have programs that they've been funding for years, contracts with their teachers or classified employees, other kinds of commitments, and they're being expected to live up to those obligations. So part of the question is do we now establish a new base that's down here, or do we try and bring all of our districts up? And the problems I have, and this is a district that's not in my assembly district, but let me tell you about New Haven. New Haven currently has 9 furlough days. Its employees have taken a 1% cut in salary. It has had a freeze on step and column, so no longevity increases on top of that. It's facing increased health costs, increased costs for special education. It currently has a $4 million deficit and is expecting to have a $2 million deficit. And New Haven's a loser under this formula. So, you know, we have to talk about adequacy, and we have to talk about how do we, you know, is there some base restoration that should happen with all of our districts? Or should we have a situation where Peter's district continues to have all these furlough days and the students get one level of education, and my district gets more, and we not only eliminate the furlough days, but we're able to start adding programs. So, you know, we've got a system that's complex, that needs to be simplified, but I do think adequacy has to be part of the discussion, and then we have to talk about what's the most thoughtful way to get there. So we're not creating a system that has, you know, just different problems.
Mm-hmm. Nick, should adequacy be part of the funding formula discussion?
Well, I think it is, obviously. But you know, the other sort of question that comes to mind is how do you really ever get to, you know, whatever it may be, an adequate funding level for every district, for every child, based on the needs of those childs in the existing funding system. I don't think you can. You've got to change the way we fund schools in order to get there. So I would actually say this is a prerequisite for getting to adequacy. Now, also to address, the other issue the Assembly member raised, yeah, every school has been cut. Every district has borne significant cuts. And the administration, along with implementing this formula, the priority is to restore those cuts. We have the implementation of the formula and restoring the cuts as sort of priorities in terms of education finance over the next few years. So that's why, we're proposing to, put money into the system to restore those cuts while at the same time moving to the new funding structure.
Thanks. A quick kind of process question, but I wanted to ask, the governor had obviously made this proposal in the budget process, and Assemblywoman, you introduced it in a policy bill last week, AB 88, and it'll now go to your committee. What's the expectation of how this will develop? I mean, might this still be on a track to be considered in this year's budget, or is it going to be a longer discussion, or do you have a sense of what to expect?
Well, my hope is that we can work with the governor's office and find a way to accomplish the goal. But again, I truly believe that you have to have a thoughtful discussion. What we've been saying for months now is everyone's a winner. That's all we've been saying. Under this new formula, everyone's a winner. And who can argue that you need local control? Who can argue that at-risk students need more funding and more time and support? But we haven't been giving people all the information, and yes, everyone's getting more money next year, but some are getting considerably more than others relative to where they are. And when we talk about restoring the base, if one district's base is restored 5 or 6 years after another district, that puts that district in a very difficult situation. So I think we need to have that thoughtful discussion and hopefully find a way to achieve the goals, and I think as Nick has been saying, maybe make it better, maybe have real accountability and have something that we all believe we can live with.
Mm-hmm. And Nick, the governor put this in the budget, obviously. What's the feeling about going through the policy process with this issue?
I think our only feeling, I mean, the legislative process is, the legislature, and we're very appreciative of the Assemblymember taking it up as a bill in her policy committee. But we do think, the budget the governor proposed is based on this formula. We see them, the budget and the formula is, intrinsically linked. We don't think you can do a budget and not do the formula. So we think they have to happen regardless of the legislative process. They need to happen at the same time. And we're very open to whatever the process the legislature would like to pursue to do that. We're very, very happy to engage in that.
Great, thank you. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions. Sure are a lot on this topic. So is anybody, any questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, I'm Liz Guillen with Public Advocate. I'd like to hear from both Assemblywoman Buchanan and Mr. Birdsall. What I think I'm hearing is that without adequacy, we can't move forward to change to a weighted system. And it sounds like that could be translated as the inability to get to adequacy justifies the perpetuation of the unfair advantage that many districts have now over others in the base funding.
I don't think that's true.
Okay, will you explain?
Yeah, I mean, right now what you have is this is where the districts are, right? And then you have a new base that the governor says where districts should be at, okay? And that base, we used to call it revenue limit, but the base now is adjusted for class size reduction and career tech. And what the governor is saying is that, okay, let's say we're $10 billion short from being able to fund that base. If I only have $1 billion, then I'll bring every district up 10% closer to the base, right? Because $1 billion is 10% of $10 billion. I'll bring everyone up 10% closer to what that base is. And then on top of that, you make other adjustments. If you have a higher base that reflects adequacy, you still have $1 billion, so it may not be 10%, maybe it's 8 or 7%, and you still can provide additional funds for at-risk students on top of that. But what you're doing is setting a base at a level where every child can receive an adequate education. In either way, whether it's the governor's base or an adequate base, it's still an aspirational base, and it'll change a little bit the trajectory of when you get to that base, but it does not mean that you can't give money on top of that base to at-risk students.
Peter,
and-
you have thought about that?
Well, if I somehow conveyed that the discussion of adequacy would prevent us from moving forward on a new funding formula, that I apologize for being unclear, because I don't think that's accurate. I thought what I said is that we have money, we need to allocate it, and it makes sense, to, the word I use is tilt, but to direct more of the money on balance towards districts that have a higher impaction of English learners and low-income students. So now the degree to which you do it, what I tried to raise there is, there's political calculus. You don't want to go so far that you create a divisive atmosphere across the entire education community in terms of moving forward towards adequacy. And I did say that I think adequacy clearly is part of the conversation here, but ultimately you're not going to address adequacy in this package because you got to find the revenues. So that'll be separate concurrent conversations going on within the education community and the legislature. I'm sure others are looking at that. But so, no, I don't think discussion of adequacy prevents us trying to address, the needs that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes, John.
Both PPIC and the panel, I'm down in the weeds about the data. People have noted that Department of Finance has some data, PPI has data, Department of Education has data, and they're all different by some substantive amount. So, specific question. When we talk about free and reduced price lunch for every school in every district, are we talking about students eligible, students served, or for students for which we have a signed document? They are all different numbers. Some schools, when you get to 80%, you can write down 100% and serve all your kids, but you don't have 100% poverty. And a lot of schools do that. So which number are you including in your data? Is it the 100%? Is it kids served, or is kids eligible for which I have a signed statement?
So Nick, why don't you take, what are we
So-
talking about when we
So,
talk about
so
free
in
and
our
reduced price
in our
lunch?
data, we basically have the numbers of kids served. That's actually what is currently reported. We're certainly open to discussion with folks as to whether it should be instead, the signed document or some measure of eligible. I think we've cast around a bit for other measures of low income or other measures of need. And it seems at this point that free and reduced price lunch counts is the best measure of that's available. As we've certainly talked to John a bit about data issues, and we'll continue to, and that's something we need to continue to work with Department of Ed and with the CSIS. We've got some ideas about having county offices do a little more review and checking of that data, including a sort of an audit requirement, have auditors check the data as well, things like that, to ensure that the data that's reported is an accurate measure of the neediness of the students in each district.
I think you're pointing out another reason why this needs to go to policy committee. Because, the question is, should it be based on the 80 or should it be based on 100, which makes a difference in funding. As you know, there are many kids, by the time they're in high school, don't apply for free and reduced lunch anymore because they don't want that stigma. You have charter schools that don't provide lunches, so they wouldn't have anyone that's eligible for free and reduced lunch. And so, you know, again, I think if you're going to do this, those questions may be getting down in the weeds, but you know what? You can have an idea up here that sounds really good, but they're the people who are on the ground, who are down in the weeds, who have to make all this stuff work. And I don't know why we can't take the time to put this through policy committee, to ask all those questions and to find some thoughtful answers so we all know where we're going.
Yeah, John, I just want to add one comment, because you talked about projections, but in terms of behavior also, I think almost one of the few guarantees I'd make of this bill is you'd have a dramatic increase in number of students eligible for free and reduced price lunches. You know, it is correct. The assumption is at the high school level, it's harder to get them signed up, but if you start providing an extra $2,200, $2,500 for each student, that's a lot of magazine sales to go out and get that. So I think your question isn't just on the projections, but it's on the impact on behavior and the ultimate funding. It's an important topic.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, hi, my name's Kristen Connolly. I'm with California Forward. I'm a constituent of yours, Assemblymember Buchanan. So I was wondering, you know, we've been very supportive about, you know, moving government closer to the people and increasing accountability. And I just wanted to see if you could elaborate a little bit more on your concerns about accountability, which I think are really very valid in terms of what you would like to see or how to improve the current proposal.
Well, there's nothing in the accountability requirement that says the additional dollars that you're getting have to be spent on the at-risk students. And to me, that's sort of simple. Right now, under the current system with EIA, that money has to be spent on those students. And, you know, the whole idea of spending additional funds is that we take this achievement gap and we close it. And if you're going to close it, you've got to provide more time and support to those students who aren't succeeding. You've got to sit down and take a look at where our students are academically and find a way to close that achievement gap. And there's absolutely nothing in the proposal. I don't care the reports and the county oversight and everything else. There's nothing in the proposal that requires you to spend those dollars on at-risk students. And I think that's a problem.
Can I just, one thing on that? So, you know, there's nothing in there that, like EIA, requires you to say, okay, here's a student, here's the dollar we spend on that individual student. There is, however, language in our proposal that that money be spent, and, you know, we're working on making sure this language is tight enough, but for the benefit of those students. So that allows us, so it's I would call it is more similar to a sort of a Title I sort of approach, whereas you can spend the money on things that maybe you have a school that has predominantly low-income and English learner students, or even a classroom that's predominantly that, and say you want to provide professional development to that teacher that's specifically targeted at serving those students. Well, just because that teacher is teaching, you know, a few free and reduced price lunch students, non-EL students, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to do that with that money. We think we should. We think that we need to provide that additional flexibility with that money, that would, you know, lead to better service for those students than what is currently provided under EIA.
There is nothing in the proposal. Title I, in essence, does follow the student. If you don't have 100%, if you have 80% Title I, you're still spending it on that classroom. EIA, you spend it on the classroom. There is absolutely nothing in the governor's proposal that if a district got 40% more dollars would prevent that district from taking 30% of it and spending it district-wide and taking 10% and focusing on a program. There's absolutely nothing in the proposal that ties those additional funds to either the students or the classrooms or the school where we have these at-risk students.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I need to jump in on this one too,
No,
because this
please.
does get to the, at the beginning I talked about the issue of accountability, and this is really a thorny issue, because the other example of that is, and we dealt with this with districts that, with categorical resources where they wanted to buy iPads for all the students, or they wanted to buy the new instructional materials program that's aligned with the current standards. And If it's categorical, it's just for certain students, then, you know, in the worst world of categoricals, they say, well, you can't use the categorical funds to support that activity because that is a function of the core program. It's not a supplemental program. So you can't, you know, we give all this money to districts and they can't use it to buy the iPads for all the students. They can't use it to buy the new instruction materials. Or you say, well, you can pay for it for those students, but the other students have to be paid for out of your regular general fund, and so now you're actually cutting away there. So it is a very important but a really difficult, complicated issue.
It's like a lot to talk.
That's why moving towards outcomes. What do you?
For Nick. I'm Rachel. I'm from the California Charter School Association, and I had a question for charters that are approved by their county or by the State Board of Ed. How will you determine which will they be? How will their funding be determined? Will they be by the district in which they physically reside? How does that work?
So you're probably referring to the concentration factor. All the other funding, will go to a charter school as if it was a district, except for the concentration factor. So we've got a cap on the concentration factor that is, you can't get a higher concentration factor than the district within which the charter exists. So it's based on the location of the charter, not the authorizer.
Other questions? Yes.
Excuse me. I hope my voice will hold up. So my name is Tevin. I've been to forums and hearings of legislature like this for some three decades. I've spent 40 years representing 7 different unions, representing employees in schools, colleges, cities, counties, state. At what point are we going to have a conversation about, adequate revenues for all the state of California, and repealing Prop 13 and repealing Prop 98, restoring the vehicle license fee, having an oil severance tax, all these things, and quite seriously, a form about revenue adequate to fund all the things we need. Because otherwise we go to these forums year after year after year, we talk about accountability, we talk about all these other things, but the bottom line is, we're either 47th in funding or 49th or 43rd. We don't have adequate funds. That's the bottom line.
So, Nick, do you want to take a shot at maybe?
Obviously, Prop 30 was a pretty significant step towards that, right? But I mean, it's been a discussion that's been happening for years and years and years, probably since even before Prop 13, right? I mean, and there's obviously some political issues in the state that that are unfortunately precluding more action on that at this point in time. But I mean, the governor, stepped up and he backed Prop 30, and I don't think anyone's saying that was enough, but it's it seems to be what he could do at this point in time.
I just want to say I appreciate the governor's stepping forward with Prop 30, clearly supported it. Many of you in this room supported Prop 30. It's really sort of like the tourniquet that's stopping the bleeding, because part of the money is being used to eliminate some of the deferrals, not all, and certainly we appreciate that. We are going to have another recession again, and we can't go into it with the $10 billion in deferrals we've had in education. Some of it is giving us new funding, but it's not bringing our schools anywhere up close to the 2007, 2008 pre-recession level. And one of my great concerns, if we don't have a conversation about adequacy, even if we can't fund it now, is that we might make the public think that we're solving the funding problem for education. We might make them think that if we have just local control and they don't have to, and we're transferring some of these categorical programs and eliminating the restrictions, that we're solving the funding problem. The biggest categorical programs are programs like transportation, special ed, and others. So what we're really giving flexibility on a very small proportion there, and we're really not solving that funding problem. And I don't want to make people think we are, because it's going to be hard to get them to support future funding for public education if we can't have that open and honest discussion about that. And we've been on a downward spiral in education, as you've alluded to, for years. When I was a kid in California, we were funded 5th in the nation. The students performed 5th in the nation. We had one of the greatest college and university systems in the world. We were the envy of everyone else. And you see that eroding at every level. And we have a much more challenging population we have to educate today than we did, 30 or 40 years ago. And I do believe, when I said at the very beginning, we have a moral imperative to make sure every child learns, and an economic imperative, because we can't have a strong economy without a well-educated workforce. And somehow we've got to have that discussion. It has to take place. And then we need real leadership. We need leadership that's willing to go out there and help us find the revenues we need so that every kid in California has the opportunity to build a great future. We're not doing that today. And it's like we're rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. This idea that we can't distribute education dollars if we don't have a new formula is not true at all. The Constitution is very clear with Prop 98 how much money goes to education. And we do need to make changes. We have a system that's convoluted and doesn't make sense. We have children that need more time and support. But again, going back to where we started, whatever we do, we're 49th in the nation today. We will be 49th in the nation the day after we pass the budget. And we won't be solving those deeper problems. So do we need to act? I think we do. But we also need to be honest with the people in the state of California.
Thank you. Yep, it's an important issue. Yep.
Hi, yes, Captain Wells from Educate Our State. Can you confirm that the governor's office is ready and willing to work with the experts in the legislature to address some of the problems that have come up in this discussion?
Been ready for over a year and a half.
And
things changing?
What's that?
Do you see some of these issues around accountability and money, the students who need it most being addressed?
Well, certainly. I mean, we've as I think last year, Prop 30 ended up, there was I think an agreement among all parties that Prop 30 kind of needed to be, once we got to the end of the process, I think everyone agreed, well, okay, Prop 30 needs to be the focus. So the administration agreed to sort of back off last year, but we've been continuing to certainly engage education stakeholders and legislative staff. Been continuing the whole time to have discussions with them, and more are seeing. We're very happy to see more and more interest now from legislative members themselves. And whenever I've met with a few members, we'll continue this week to meet with several members, and as well as other people in the governor's office will be meeting with them. So, whenever the legislature's ready to engage and discuss, I mean, we'll jump.
I'm thrilled to hear that, because we've been asking for a bill for months and have not gotten anything from the governor's office in terms of a bill to be able to bring it to policy committee, which is why we went ahead and decided that we needed to author AB 88 so we could get it to policy committee to have those discussions. And I'm looking forward to engaging in those discussions. And there were a series of stakeholder meetings, 3 meetings during the recess period, and I'm looking forward to discussing the recommendations that came out of those that really have not been incorporated into the plan. So I think it's time, and I think we have shared goals. We all come from different places, but I'm thrilled to hear that the governor's looking forward to engage in a policy discussion on this.
And just real quickly, in support of the administration's work, I think a lot of us feel the proposal before us now is dramatically better than the one that was last year. So there have been ongoing discussions. So.
Good. So we have time for one last question. Me? Yes.
I've been sitting here trying to Moza. My name is Maggie Ellis. I'm actually a teacher, active teacher, who has suffered through a lot of the cuts that you've talked about. And I want to thank you for wanting to look at this with a fine-tooth comb. I teach in Oak Grove. We are a district that serves a variety of populations. And under this formula, while we would see new monies, we also have the risk of being harmed in the future We have 320 square miles, much of it undeveloped. We have our our South Sacramento, North Elk Grove district area that is highly Title I, very impacted by EL and disadvantaged students. But then we have a bigger portion of our district that is not as impacted as them. And they will be hurt by this kind of a formula because of the district average. When I have school sites that have the 80% free and reduced and the 70% EL kids, but they're countered by other sites that have 50 EL kids and not as many free and reduced, only 30%. Those are the kinds of things I, as a teacher, am begging you to take a look at, because I may one year teach at a Title I, the next year I teach at a different kind of school, but those services to those kids who are in need don't change because of the school site they're at. An EL kid in our north area is no different than an EL kid in our southern area. And those are the kinds of concerns that I have, that I don't know if that discussion is happening because we're looking at a big picture, not at a school site.
So Nick, how does
It's not
a
a
district?
question.
Sure. When we are, and this is mainly, the concentration factor is the main thing that is, I know, I've certainly heard from the superintendent of Elk Grove, he's concerned about. And that is something we are looking at to see whether, the pros and cons of allocating the concentration factor on a school site basis or not. So that's something we just need to work through. And up to this point, we've really wanted to focus on sort of a district level funding model, because ultimately it is the district governing board that, in our opinion, should be deciding how to allocate the resources, and should be allocating more resources to the schools that are the neediest relative to the other schools. So that's been our focus, but we are looking at more of a school site, at least for the concentration factor.
I've met with Steve. I used to represent part of Elk Grove, and I definitely understand, and it's just another area of concern, I guess you should say. I mean, another reason that we do need to get into the weeds on this and understand the differences between a big district like Elk Grove, that's the 5th biggest in the state of California, and the fact that it could have schools that have 75 or 80% free and reduced lunch, and others that have very small percentage, and yet those students don't count the same as in a district that would have 75 or 80% total students. And the question is why is your student less valuable than another? And I think those are questions that have to be answered.
Mm-hmm. So I think our time's up, and I want to say a very big thank you to the panel. And thank you all for coming.